mass suicide adhere to the Mayan calendar, which predicts the end of time.
2012 has reached its end, along with the Mayan calendar, but it looked more like this.
A decade of war is ending.
This year,
The people!
Уважать и охранять.
Well, we're still here, and when it comes down to it, the world not only didn't end, but very little changed in 2012. We have the same challenges facing the globe, the same conflicts preventing peace, the same policies hampering solutions, and many of the same people in power as we come into 2013. So what will 2012 be remembered for? Let's take a look back. For some in Gaza, their world did end when Israel launched a short but deadly campaign in response to rockets fired by Hamas after one of their leaders was assassinated. The U.S. solidly backed Israel, but critics claim the use of disproportionate force has become too common a practice for the Israeli Defense Force, with journalists also being targeted and children becoming casualties.
It has the same policy, if you like, as the United States with regard to collateral damage, that it's happy to injure dozens of Palestinian men, women and children as long as it can kill one person who might have helped fire a rocket into Israel.
Shortly after a ceasefire, Palestine celebrated gaining UN non-member status, but it's still a long way from statehood, as is the region from a peaceful two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. This while conflict continues to rage in neighboring Syria.
You know that Bashar Assad cannot possibly stay running his country. He has to go.
Assad must go.
Bashar al-Assad doit partir.
Demands and predictions that Syria's president would fall in 2012 went unfulfilled. He sat down for an exclusive interview with RT well into the year, insisting he would not give up as the push for regime change continued and terror reigned in his country.
I'm not popular. I wasn't made by the West to go to the West or to any other country. I'm Syrian. I'm made in Syria, and I have to live in Syria and die in Syria.
Deemed everything from civil war to sectarian fighting to terrorism to genocide. Syria stayed the center of a media war throughout 2012, with unconfirmed atrocities on both sides haunting the web, and only one side taking the brunt of the blame.
Assad is crazy. He's a brutal dictator. He's killing his own people. This is the same narrative that we heard about Gaddafi.
But we didn't hear much about Libya in 2012 on most networks or from Western officials. Not until the aftermath of regime change there and the terror that ensued went too far. The U.S. ambassador and embassy staff were killed in Benghazi in September.
The most significant event of 2012 is the failure of NATO to follow up on its Libya momentum to create a forced regime change through proxy mercenaries in Syria. And the fact that Russia and China and Iran stood firm on that upset the entire timetable that NATO had in mind to run this destabilization. And now the entire Arab Spring scenario is it's not disintegrating, it's becoming a nightmare.
One that spread to Western allies in the region like Bahrain, where mass protest, arrest, and even death haven't provoked much global media coverage or any push for democracy. Instead, provocations like the film The Innocence of a Muslim made headlines and incited outrage across the Arab world. Funded in the U.S. and considered highly offensive to Islam, the movie didn't go over well in states now run by Islamists after post-revolution polls in Egypt and Tunisia. U.S. embassies were left in shambles as flags burned and freedom of speech was back on the debate table. The film was banned in some countries like Russia and defended by others like the States as a protected right of expression. A right not awarded to whistleblowers like Julian Assange, who had a busy year. He was granted political asylum by Ecuador after being released on bail while awaiting a British court's decision on his extradition to Sweden. For most of 2012, Assange remained under house arrest, but still managed to find a way to leak.
We can change the world tomorrow.
His groundbreaking exclusive interview show premiered on RT. Assange sat down with guests shunned by the mainstream media, like Hezbollah's Hassan Nasrallah and internet freedom activists, the cypherpunks.
The future of the internet.
I think no journalist worth his salt in the world working today has not used a WikiLeaks cable, whether it be at the lowest level of covering their local health center to the idea of schools, education, let alone geopolitics.
Still, many journalists slammed Assange's work on RT, and he continues to be a man the West and mainstream media love to hate, while he remains holed up at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, fearing UK officials will grab him the moment he steps outside. Protests ripped across Europe in 2012 as the Euro crisis worsened, leaving many no choice but to go out onto the streets.
So many people are becoming desperate.
People are getting angrier and angrier.
Spain had millions on the street at a time demanding the government stop cuts, and demos continued in Greece, who got a €44 billion bailout. Masses were met with heavy-handed policing in most countries across the EU, which was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 2012.
They ultimately, if there are too many protests, won't even be able to afford the policemen on the streets. And therefore, we could actually end up not so much with a violent reaction from government, but there's actually a danger of anarchy because government itself may break down.
The crowd is easy to mock.
Not the case in the U.S., where the Occupy movement lost momentum this year. Corporate-backed media and authorities managed to dull demonstrations demanding economic equality and responsibility.
I just want to have a party. It's like
the only way for Occupy to expand from its niche and from the fact that they're usually derided by the elites as a bunch of anarchists or young people or students who don't have anything better to do, is to organize themselves politically.
Something the group is promising in 2013, with some predicting the OWS movement might have better luck in Europe. Russia saw protests this year leading up to and after Vladimir Putin was elected for a third time as president, but not nearly as big as what we saw at the end of 2011.
I think the demonstrations in Russia were motivated by frustration. The demonstrators had a clear political goal, which was to discredit the reputation of President Putin and the power of United Russia, knowing that that President Putin and United Russia were going to win the elections. They had no choice, they had no possibility of beating them in an election, so their strategy was instead to discredit them, at least in the eyes of the West.
Just before Putin's inauguration, protests in central Moscow turned violent for the first time since the recent opposition movement began rallying. Arrests were made and both protesters and police reported injuries. Several demonstrators faced court hearings on charges of inciting mass public disorder, and a dozen more trials will carry on in the new year, with the opposition claiming this is all part of a Kremlin clampdown on their movement. But Putin's re-election and protests didn't get nearly as much attention as this. Pussy Riot's Rock Riot on the altar of Christ the Savior and the scandal that followed made world headlines, took over the blogosphere, and had celebrities like Madonna defending them, while the Russian Orthodox Church was outraged.
There is no defense in this case. It's simple PR. Lawyers aren't clocking up on hourly fee. They're working towards the brand in order to capitalize on it in the future. And it's worked.
Some of the group's girls got 2 years in jail for the stunt, which was criticized by the West as too harsh. The story remained in the headlines for weeks on end, leaving little room for stories like this. U.S. presidential candidate Jill Stein and her running mate arrested for protesting outside a debate for top party-only candidates Obama and Romney.
The American system is designed to eliminate political opposition, like some of the dictatorships that we criticize. The debate makes a mockery of our democracy.
Despite being on the ballot in enough states to technically win, Stein and other candidates were not allowed to debate and got almost no coverage in the lead-up to elections on U.S. networks. Instead, third-party candidates' only chance to debate live on television was from RT's Washington studio.
I think our founding fathers would be spinning in their graves if they could see this.
In line with polls and predictions, Obama won the election. But his work is cut out for him, along with other world leaders for the year to come, a rough economy, growing discontent, and conflicts either standing still or raging wild. Anissa Nawe, RT.